He sat alone in a quiet room, the afternoon light spilling across the table. In his hands was a single piece of paper, his husband's death certificate. Next to the line that said spouse, there was only a blank space. For the law, his love didn't exist. For him, it was everything: 20 years of shared breakfasts, whispered jokes, gentle arguments, and the kind of silence that feels like home. That blank space wasn't just a missing name. It was the sound of a promise being denied. Most people grieve by letting go, but he couldn't. Not yet. Because love, when it's real, doesn't fade quietly. It fights softly, but relentlessly. That's when he made a choice. If the world refused to see his love, he would make it impossible to ignore. He didn't plan to become a symbol. He just wanted to keep his husband's name where it belonged beside his own. This isn't a story about politics or law. It's a story about grief, courage, and a love that refused to be erased. It started with a tremor, just a small shake in John's hand while he was buttoning his shirt. "It's nothing," he said, smiling like always. But it wasn't. The doctor called it ALS, a disease that slowly steals everything but the mind. Jim tried to stay calm, nodding, while the doctor explained what would happen. Inside, his world was collapsing. In the months that followed, John began to lose his strength. The man who once loved dancing in the kitchen could no longer stand. Jim became his hands, his voice, his everything. He brushed his hair, read him books, helped him breathe when the nights grew long. They talked about endings, not with fear, but with love. One evening, John whispered, "I want you to be my husband before it's too late." Marriage wasn't legal in Ohio, but they didn't care. Friends helped raise money to rent a small medical plane. The flight lasted less than an hour, from Cincinnati to Maryland, the nearest state that would say yes. Inside the plane, surrounded by machines and sunlight, Jim held John's trembling hand. The pilot turned and said softly, "You may begin." Their vows were short. Their love was not. 2 signatures, 1 kiss, and the sound of engines roaring beneath them. At 30,000 feet above the ground, they were finally married, suspended between heaven and earth, where love didn't need permission. When the plane landed back in Ohio, Jim thought the air would feel lighter. It didn't. The world below the clouds seemed colder than the one they had just left. The wedding rings on their fingers still gleamed, but in the eyes of their home state, they meant nothing. At the airport, a customs officer smiled politely at John's wheelchair, then looked away when he saw the rings. Their marriage license, signed with trembling hands above the clouds, was just a story Ohio refused to believe. In their neighborhood, news spread quickly. Someone left a newspaper clipping on their doorstep. "Ohio couple marries in the sky." The tone wasn't kind. Neighbors stopped waving. The woman next door who used to bring pie didn't come by anymore. But inside their small house, everything remained the same. The smell of coffee in the morning, John's favorite jazz record spinning softly in the background, the sunlight that warmed the wooden floor. Jim tried to hold on to those ordinary things. They were proof that life was still theirs. Every night, he framed their marriage certificate by John's bed. Before turning off the lamp, he'd touch the glass and whisper, "You're my husband. That's all that matters." Yet deep down, the silence outside their door began to sound like a warning. A reminder that love, no matter how real, was still invisible here. The winter that followed was cruel. John's voice became a whisper, his hands too weak to hold a spoon. The walls of their home filled with the quiet sounds of oxygen machines and the soft hum of time running out. Jim kept smiling for him. He read aloud from the old travel books they used to love, places they had dreamed of visiting, but never would. One afternoon, a hospice nurse asked Jim a simple question about paperwork. "When he passes," she said gently, "do you want your name listed on the death certificate?" Jim hesitated, confused. The nurse lowered her voice. "Ohio doesn't allow that." For a moment, everything in the room stopped: the machines, the breath, even the light. "You mean," he said, "I'll be erased?" She didn't answer. That night, Jim sat by John's bedside, watching the man he loved drift in and out of sleep. The ring on John's finger caught the light, a quiet reminder of the promise they made above the clouds. He whispered, "They can ignore the paper, but they can't erase you. Not from me." Still, deep inside, something had changed. He realized love could survive everything except silence. And Jim decided he would not stay silent anymore. The morning after that conversation, the house felt heavier. Jim sat by the window, holding the marriage license in his hands, the same one they had signed above the clouds. The ink had begun to fade at the edges, as if the world itself was trying to erase it. He looked at John, sleeping beside him, pale and fragile, but still beautiful. And something inside him shifted. This couldn't be how their story ended, not with a blank space, not with silence. He made a few phone calls, unsure what he was even asking for. "I just want my name next to his," he told a local lawyer. "That's all." Most people would have let it go, but Jim couldn't, because love had asked him to stay, and staying meant fighting. Within days, reporters began calling. Friends warned him, "Are you sure you want to do this? People might turn on you." Jim smiled softly. "They already have." When John woke that afternoon, Jim told him what he'd done. John's eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but pride. "Promise me you'll see it through," he whispered. Jim nodded. "I will. For both of us." And in that quiet room, surrounded by machines and fading light, a love story became a fight for recognition, not just for them, but for every couple who had ever been told they didn't exist. The seasons changed, but time inside their home stopped. Jim learned to measure the days not by dates, but by John's breaths, slow, shallow, precious. Reporters still called, lawyers still emailed, but the only thing Jim wanted was more time. Time to talk, time to laugh, time to love. One evening, the nurse turned off the machines and said softly, "It's time to say goodbye." Jim took John's hand, thinner now, cold around the edges. "You rest," he whispered. "I'll finish what we started." John smiled barely, and then he was gone. The house felt too quiet. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Days later, the funeral came and went. Friends spoke in trembling voices. Jim stood beside the coffin, still wearing his wedding ring. He didn't cry. He just placed his hand on the lid and said, "They can't erase us anymore." But grief doesn't end when the guests leave. It lingers in the way you fold the sheets, in the way you pour one cup of coffee instead of two. Every night, he sat by the framed license and whispered, "We're still married." And even though John was gone, the fight was not. Because somewhere between love and loss, Jim had found something unbreakable, purpose. The house was silent again. But this time, it wasn't peace, it was absence. John's chair sat empty by the window. The sheets still smelled like him, and the ring on Jim's hand felt heavier than ever. The day after the funeral, the lawyer called. "We can stop now, Jim," he said softly. "You've done enough." But Jim shook his head. "No, we're not done. His name still isn't there." He walked to the courthouse the next morning with the marriage license pressed against his chest. The guards looked at him curiously, an ordinary man with extraordinary quiet. "I'm not fighting the state," he told a reporter outside. "I'm fighting for one line on one piece of paper." The world began to notice. Letters arrived from people he'd never met. Couples, parents, strangers, all saying thank you. Some nights, Jim still dreamed of John. In those dreams, they were always in the sky again, sunlight pouring through the window of that small plane. John would smile and say, "Keep going." And so he did. With trembling hands and steady courage, Jim Obergefell filed his appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. Love had become law's loudest question, and Jim was ready to answer it. On June 26, 2015, the nation held its breath. Outside the Supreme Court, crowds gathered, flags waving, voices trembling, cameras ready. Inside, Jim sat quietly, his hands folded around a photograph of John. The justices entered. The room fell into silence. Then, a voice read the words that would echo through history. "The Constitution grants them equal dignity in the eyes of the law." 5 votes to 4. Jim closed his eyes. The crowd outside erupted tears, laughter, hands raised to the sky. But inside him, it wasn't victory he felt. It was peace. He looked down at John's picture, his voice breaking. "We did it," he whispered. "You can rest now." Reporters rushed to him. Microphones everywhere, flashes blinding. But Jim only said one thing. This wasn't about politics, it was about love. A love that deserved to be seen. That evening, as the sun set behind the Capitol, the world watched buildings light up in rainbow colors. Jim stood quietly on the steps, holding the photo close. The law had finally caught up with love, and for the first time, his husband's name would never be erased again. After the ruling, the noise faded, the cameras left, the crowds went home, and Jim returned to the same quiet house in Cincinnati, the one filled with memories of coffee, music, and laughter that belonged to someone who was no longer there. On the kitchen wall still hung a small photograph. John smiling on the day of their wedding in the sky, sunlight washing over his face. Jim would stand there sometimes, coffee in hand, and whisper, "We made it, love. We really did." Oh? The phone still rang with interview requests, invitations, awards. But Jim always said the same thing. This wasn't my victory. It was ours. It was his. He spent the following years speaking quietly at schools, community halls, and churches, not about law or justice, but about love. He'd tell them, love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just keeps showing up. When asked if he still missed John, he smiled softly. "Every day. But I also carry him in every couple that dares to hold hands in public, in every person who chooses to love without fear." The world had changed that summer. Not overnight, and not for everyone. But for Jim, love had already won. Not in the courtroom, but in the quiet promise that two people made 30,000 feet above the clouds. Love didn't change the world overnight. It didn't erase prejudice or rewrite every law. But it did something quieter. It stayed. Jim Obergefell's fight began with a blank space on a piece of paper. What he didn't know was that the space he filled would open a door for millions of others. Today, when two people stand together and say, "I do," they may never know his name. They may never know John's either. But their freedom to love, to be seen, to be counted carries the echo of two men who refuse to disappear. Love doesn't always look like grand gestures. Sometimes it's paperwork. Sometimes it's silence. And sometimes it's a man holding a photograph, whispering to it every morning, "We did it." This isn't just a story about equality. It's a story about remembrance, about what happens when one person decides that love deserves to be written down and never erased again. If this story touched you, share it. Somewhere, someone still needs to believe that love, even when quiet, even when unseen, can move mountains. Because in the end, love doesn't ask for permission. It just keeps showing up, every day, in every heart, brave enough to stay.